The Gemara famously rules that a childless couple must divorce after 10 years of infertility. Yet, for as long as anyone can remember, this halacha was often ignored, and it was certainly not enforced by Jewish courts of law. In this class, we explore the history of this halacha, focusing on how, when, and why this law was so often overlooked. There's a well-known din that if a couple is married for 10 years and they don't have children, then that needs to spell the end of the couple's marriage. Let's read the din in the Seches Yevamis, Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says as follows: Tanu Rabbanon, we learned, the Chachamim taught and learned, Nasa Isha Vishaha Ima Esar Shanim. If a person married a woman and dwelt with her for 10 years, v'lo yolda, and did not give birth, they did not have children, yoitzi v'yiten ksuba, he needs to divorce her, and he needs to make the ksuba payment, and it's the end of the marriage. Why? Shema lo zacha liyibanes mimena. We presume that it is very possible, and indeed the 10 years seem to be evidence, that he will not merit to have children from her. In other words, how long is too long? According to this Gemara, 10 years is too long. The man has a chiyuv of pru-ruvu, that is to have children. And here, it's not working out. So he has a mitzvah of pru-ruvu, so this is what he needs to do. This is what the Gemara says. Now, we need to ask ourselves a question when we're thinking about this din. Why does he have to divorce his wife? Remember, we're talking about the Gemara. This is long before the Takana Rabbeinu Gershom. If it's long before the Takana Rabbeinu Gershom, a man could marry one wife, he can marry a second wife, he can marry a third wife. So, why does he need to divorce his wife? L'chayra, shouldn't we just say that we just marry a second wife? So Rashi deals with this in Ksubos, and Rashi says as follows: The midoiraisa loy michayav la'afuka. Minat Torah, you're right. There is no chiyuv to divorce her minat Torah. Why? The efshar likach loy isha acheres etzla, because he could take a second wife. Avo midrabanan kamar. This is a din midrabanan. The idea that you need to divorce the first wife is a din midrabanan. The chol kama. The isa laha gabe, because as long as you're married to the first one, the bottom line is loy nasiv achriti, you're not going to marry another one. In other words, what is it saying over here? There's multiple ways of interpreting this. One is from the man's perspective. The idea of being married to a second wife is very, very difficult, so therefore we assume it's not going to happen. So therefore, Chachamim say you need to get divorced. Or maybe you say mitzad the wife. Maybe you're ready, maybe the man is ready to marry a second wife. But there is no woman who's willing to go into a polygamous marriage, or her family isn't going to be willing to allow her into a polygamous marriage. And so therefore, as much as he wants, he's not going to be able to discover a second wife. Either way, the bottom line is, second marriage is not going to happen. A marriage to a second wife is not going to happen, that is the svara, that's the logic of why the Chachamim said that he has to divorce her after 10 years, assuming that will enable him to find another wife to get married. Now, one more ha'ara about this din. It is well known that the chiyuv of pru-ruvu is one man and one woman. So therefore, one boy and one girl. So therefore, one would assume that this din would remain relevant not only if a person had a child, but until a person had one boy and one girl. In other words, until a person was mekayim the mitzvah of pru-ruvu. But the reality is nishtazoi. The reality is nishtazoi. The Ramban says as follows: Umiyu hayaloi mimena ben echad. If you had one child, ein moitzi anaisam yada, then there is no divorce necessary. Shaloi shaninu ela lo yolda. All we say is la yolda. The Mishnah, the din says 10 years without any children. Hayolda klal. If there's any child, lo say. It's a very interesting thing. I saw one of the Achrayim compares this to the din of Yibum. We know the din of Yibum is that if a man dies childless, so the minat Torah, the woman goes to the brother. Okay, if they're not going to do Yibum, you do chalitza. That din only applies if there's no children. If there's one child, whether it's a boy or a girl, the din of Yibum doesn't apply. So we see that there's a special inyan in Torah that putting the mitzvah of pru-ruvu aside, one boy, one girl, there's a special inyan in Torah where the Torah wants to make sure there's at least something that's here. And that seems to be what's happening here. The Ramban is learning that that's the pshat over here, that when there's this rule, a very severe rule, a very strict rule, a very difficult rule, which is what we're going to grapple with today in today's class. when we see this rule, that after 10 years there needs to be a divorce, it only is if there's no children whatsoever. If there's any sort of offspring, then it's going to, this din doesn't apply. This indeed is how the Ramah paskins in Shulchan Aruch. Okay, why are we learning about this din today? We're learning about this din today because it's consistent with the value of Leben Mitatzait with the Parshas HaShavua. And that's because this din is actually derived from the story of Avram Avinu and Sarah, or Sarai, in this week's Parsha. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says in this week's parsha as follows. Look at Lech Lecha Perek Tezayim pasuk Gimel. Vatikach Sarai Eishas Avram es Hagar Amitzis Shivchasa. Sarai took Hagar Miketz Eser Shanim L'Sheves Avram Be'eretz Canaan after 10 years of Avram dwelling in Canaan. Vatiten Oisel Avram Isha Loi LeIsha, and she gave her to Avram, her husband, as a wife. Avram and Sarah did not have children, and it is at this point in the parsha that she says, you know something? I'm going to give you my shivcha. I have a shivcha named Hagar. You're going to marry her. And when did it do it? When did she do this? The pasuk goes out of its way to say that this happened Miketz Eser Shanim L'Sheves Avram Eretz Canaan. This happened 10 years after Avram is dwelling in Eretz Canaan. Says the Gemara in Yevamis Daf Samach Daled Amud Daled, Afal Pishein Raya Ledovar. Although this isn't real evidence of this din that after 10 years there needs to be a divorce, nonetheless, Zeicher Ledovar. Zeicher Ledovar, it's a memory, it's a hint. It's a hint for this. This story is a hint for this din. And it quotes the pasuk, Miketz Eser Shanim L'Sheves Avram Be'eretz Canaan. The marriage to Hagar happened 10 years after Avram was dwelling in Canaan. So just like there, Sarah waited 10 years, so too in a regular marriage we wait 10 years. Now the truth is, in a regular marriage you're waiting 10 years from marriage. Here, you're not waiting 10 years from marriage. The story of Hagar didn't happen 10 years into their marriage. The story of Hagar happened 10 years to them living in Eretz Yisrael. Continues the Gemara, there's a reason for that. The counting, when they lived outside Eretz Yisrael, Etaka didn't count. Etaka didn't count for the years. Nor in a regular marriage, it starts from, you would assume, from day one of the marriage. And Avram and Sarah, the clock started ticking when? When they came to Eretz Canaan. Why? Rashi in this week's parsha on the pasuk says, "She'ein yeshivas chutz la'aretz oilei min amin," dwelling outside Eretz Yisrael doesn't count. L'fi shaloi nemar lo ve'escha legoy gadol, because the promise, "I will make you a great nation," was stated that this would happen at sheyavel Eretz Yisrael, when you come to Eretz Yisrael. It was said about coming to Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the clock of 10 years starts ticking when they came to Eretz Yisrael, and so this is the zeicher ladavar. This is the zeicher for the din for all of Jewish history, codified in the Gemara and in Shulchan Aruch, that when a couple is married, they need to be mekayim the mitzvah of pru revu, or more precisely said, the man has a chiyuv of pru revu. And if they're married for 10 years and it didn't happen, so then he needs to make it happen. Polygamous marriage is not going to happen, so he has no choice. He has to divorce his wife. This is the din. In fact, not only is this the din, we know that for most of Jewish history, until very recently, almost all areas of Jewish life could be enforced by the Bezdin. And that means if the halacha is a certain thing, then the court, the Bezdin, has police powers. Police powers means they're going to force people to keep the halacha. So the Gemara in Ksubos discusses the fact that this is relevant for this din about the 10 years in marriage as well. It was a little bit of a machloikas, as we'll see, but let's have a read. Look at number 7. Ksubos Tav Ayin Zayin Amar Aleph. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Asi. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav Asi, Ein ma'asin ela lepsulos. The court only forces, when it comes to marriage, say, no, you can't marry that woman, or you're married, we're going to force you to get divorced. Only if someone did a real bad marriage to Isha Psula. That means, for example, a Kohen married a divorcee. That's a classic case of an example of a forbidden marriage. It's not allowed to happen. And if a court witnessed that it happened, it could intervene, use its police powers to say that we're going to dissolve this marriage. We're not going to let it happen. So Rav Yehuda Rav Asi says that's where they use their police powers. If a man dwelt with a wife for 10 years without giving birth, here the din we know is they need to separate. But the court doesn't get involved. This is the opinion Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav Asi. However, there's another Amoira, Rav Tachlifa, in the name of Shmuel, who disagrees and says, even that case, even the case of marriage for 10 years, the court actually intervenes. The Gemara continues the conversation and says, the first opinion doesn't make sense. It's very hard to fathom and understand this idea that the court, all of a sudden, in all bad marriages, the court gets involved. And this court, the court doesn't get involved. And so therefore, the Gemara basically moves away from that and says that's not the reality. And really, it assumes that even that opinion would agree, without getting into the technicalities, even that opinion would agree that there actually is coercion. In other words, if you read the Maskana of the Gemara in Ksubas, Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph, not only is the din that the man needs to separate from the wife after 10 years, but the Beis Din enforces it. And although there's the beginning of the sugya sounds like the Beis Din, according to one opinion, that maybe the Beis Din doesn't enforce it, the maskana of the sugya is very, very clear that the Beis Din does enforce it in this case as well. Okay, so this is all the din. We learned the din. What was the reality? The reality was not like the din. One sec, we'll do the questions later. The reality was not like the din. Where do we see the reality is not like the din? I'll show you 3 pieces of evidence that throughout Jewish history, the court did not get involved in this area, which also teaches us more that people weren't really observing this din. First one is the Ramah in Shulchan Aruch Even Ezer, Siman Aleph, If Gimel. Let's see what the Ramah says. The Ramah is writing the Shulchan Aruch. This is in the 1500s when he writes the Shulchan Aruch in Krakow, in Poland. He says as follows. It's a number of generations already where we're not careful about the matches, about marriages. And even if someone's married for 10 years, and now minadin, they need to get divorced, we do not force the divorce. Remember, the Rabbanim, the Batei Din, had the power to enforce. And they forced many different areas of daily life. But here the Ramah is saying that it's already a number of generations that we're not invoking this power for this din. Even though we didn't do the mitzvah yet. Also other dinim of marriages. What he does here, the Ramah is, there's a number of dinim in halakha. For example, someone shouldn't marry an older woman who isn't a young person who didn't do the mitzvah of Puruvu, shouldn't marry an older woman. That's another example. Or a young person who didn't do Puruvu shouldn't marry a girl who's too young to have children. That's another example. Or a Talmud Chacham shouldn't marry Amoretz. There's a whole bunch of dinim about proper marriage. It's not like an Isser min HaTorah, but there's a whole bunch of dinim of proper marriage. So what he's saying over here is none of these the court has been enforcing. As long as it's not prohibited. Like it can't be a Isha, married woman. There we're going to get involved. We're going to say, hey, listen, this woman's married. You can't remain married to her. Grusha, Tokayim, we're going to intervene. We're going to say, this is not okay. But all these other things, including the 10 years, it's already a number of generations that we're not forcing. Now, if we're not forcing, what does that mean? This wouldn't be a discussion if everyone is observing the halacha. In other words, if couples were getting divorced, this wouldn't even be a discussion. In other words, there were couples who weren't observing the halacha, and they weren't getting divorced. So there was a shaila, maybe the Beis Din should intervene. And in that we're hearing that already in the 1500s, the Ramah is saying that it's a few generations already that we're not getting involved. Now, very often when the Ramah gives a comment in Shulchan Aruch, he actually is not stating his own thing. Very often he's quoting an earlier source. And that's what's happening here. He's actually quoting a source that was written in the 1300s. So let's read this source. This is the Rivash. The Rivash is Rabbi Yitzchak bar Sheshes. He's one of the Rishonim. He starts out his life in Spain, but then due to persecution, he leaves Spain. And he goes to North Africa, in Algeria, I believe, is where he lives. And he's a big Rav there, and he's entering Shilas, and we have Shilas Achuvas Harivash. Let's see what was the question in this case. It's L'dayone Omanhige Kol Tenes Yitzu. So this is to a town in Algeria that's called Tenes, and there was a Jewish community there. They reached out to the Rivash with a question. What was the question? Al Dvara Ish an Shmuel Arama. There was a man named Shmuel Arama. Sharatza Lisa Zakena Achas Bas Tishim Shana Yoser. This man wants to marry a 90-year-old woman. She's plus 90 years old. Vihi Almanas Ana Bonafosh Perez de Valencia. She is the widow of this famous Gvir from Valencia. Valencia is a region in Spain. She is the widow. She's very rich. Va'kol Michel B'yadei. So the Jewish community of Tenes says, we're not going to allow this marriage to happen. They said, we're not letting you marry this lady. Why? You're not getting married for marriage. And you're looking for this lady's money. Moreover, and this is the key, you don't have children yet. So you didn't do the mitzvah pruruvu. So you're marrying a 90-year-old woman for her money, but you didn't do the mitzvah pruruvu. Okay. Va'an Shmuel HaNisker, this man, he got mad and he started cursing out the judge. He started lambasting the Jewish community. And he went to the non-Jewish ruler of Tennis in this town in Algeria, and he went and complained and said, look, the Jewish community isn't allowing me to marry the love of my life. Okay, so this turned into a little ruckus in the community. They said, you know what? Let's find out. What does Judaism say? Is this marriage kosher or not? How are we going to find out? We'll turn to the next big city, to the Rivash. This story happened sometimes in the late 1300s, early 1400s. Ask the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshes, let's find out what the din is. So he wrote the tshuva. What's the tshuva he writes as this? Shuras hadin, if you want to know the pure law, based in Moinin Oisam Elisana, then absolutely, the court gets involved and says you can't marry her. Why? You have a chi of pruruvu, you're marrying a 90-year-old woman, it's not going to happen. So Shuras hadin, if you want to know strict Talmudic law, absolutely they could intervene. All of this, that's only Shuras hadin, if you want to follow the strict letter of the law from the Gemara. Look at this lashon that he says. What should we do? We have not seen in our days. It's already a number of generations that we haven't heard of Beis Din sheniskak lazeh, of a Beis Din getting involved in these types of things. To force a divorce, to force in an instance in where they were married for 10 years with no children. We haven't seen a divorce. Beis Din intervening. We don't see the Beis Din. The din is, you can't marry a young girl if she's too young for childbearing age. We don't see the Beis Din getting involved there. The daughter of a Kohen, the daughter of a Talmud Chacham, the Gemara says shouldn't be marrying into Am Haaretz's family. We don't see the court getting involved there as well. So on the one hand, if you follow strict Talmudic law, you have the right to hold this guy back from entering this marriage. On the other hand, the reality is we don't really practice, we haven't been practicing this police powers. Therefore, what does he say? In your case, if you want to hide your eyes, in other words, if you want to ignore the matter, if you want to let this guy get married, absolutely, you don't have to enforce the din. Why? Because we have a few daitis of precedent and where this is not happening. However, he says, if you want to throw the book at him, and you really want to say, well, no, we're going to follow the strict Talmudic law, then you're allowed to. Why? He made problems. He spoke against the Dayan, he spoke against the community, so therefore, you have the ability, basically, you could do what you want over here. The Ramah, when he quotes in Shulchan Aruch and says, it's a number of generations, writing in the 1500s, it's a number of generations that we haven't get involved in marriages, he's quoting this Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshes. So in other words, here we have a rabbi who's from Spain originally in the 1300s, and toward the end of his life went to North Africa, so it's a different tradition from the Ramah, and he's saying the same thing. The Ramah is quoting him, that for a number of generations, we don't get involved in this. The same point that I said before is relevant here. It wouldn't be a relevant discussion if everyone was observing this halacha. There were couples who weren't observing this halacha. There was a question, should the court intervene? And the answer is no. So now, if you go you could say that at least from the 1300s or the 1200s in Spain, we already have evidence that this was not a halacha that was always being observed, and definitely the court was not enforcing it. However, the truth is, there's another piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence comes from a different tradition, the tradition of Ashkenaz. The Ramah quoted the Rivash, but really, there's another source that Ramah could have quoted. This is the Ravan, Rabbi Elazar ben Nosson. He's one of the earliest Rishonim in Ashkenaz. His dates are roughly from around 1090 to 1170. So it's mamish, the first generation of the Baalei HaTosfos. And he has a tshuva, he has a piece of commentary on this subject. And the one line that's relevant right now is where he says, Ein niskakim bizman hazeh la'aseh apirya v'rivya. Today, about the asay, a period of rivya, forcing men to go into a marriage or to go out of a marriage, to do anything that's involved with this mitzvah, we don't get involved. We as the court, we don't get involved. And he says this is not an invention of his generation of the early 1100s. The Gama Rishonim lo huskuku, the earlier ones didn't. Who does he mean here? He means the earlier ones like Rabbeinu Gershom Agoyla. Those were the Rishonim for him. Those were the earlier ones for him. In other words, the first generation of known Rabbanim that lived in Germany, that established the Jewish community in Ashkenaz, they didn't get involved in these areas. They didn't push this din and this halacha. So all of a sudden, basically what you're able to see is that from two different regions, from Ashkenaz and from Sfard, and this trickles down into the Shulchan Aruch, we have a very interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, you have a din. That din is a rude awakening. That din is a scary din. That din is, it's hard to appreciate that din. It's hard to understand it din. I mean, you could understand it, but it's hard to emotionally live with it. That a couple that's living 10 years, no children, have to be divorced. And then the reality is that we have so much evidence that very, very often it was not being kept, number one. And number two, and the Rabbanim never got involved in this area, even though they had the ability to. And that leads us to the question of why. Or in other words, what was the heter? What was the heter for the Beis Din to say, you know what, let it be? Why was this considered to be okay? Before we go and actually get involved in the approaches, I want to share something interesting, a little bit of a break. Share something interesting related to the Rebbe. That is as follows. In 1972, the Rebbe published his father's Torah. His father's Torah, Likutei Levi Yitzchak. Most of this material was from the material that Rebbe Levi Yitzchak wrote on the margins of his Sefer HaZohar. He wrote a shtickle commentary, and so that was published. Most of the material is that. However, one of the volumes also letters. What are these letters? What are the letters from the Rebbe's father in 1972? All the letters were from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe. The Rebbe had kept them, and so therefore preserved them. And so in 1972, he published them together with the thing. He writes, the Rebbe wrote to Pesach Davar, in the Hakdama, he himself wrote, that these letters I received from my father. Well, there are two letters that he published there, that looking at it are like, okay, it's a little bit of a private thing, but the Rebbe published it. He published it there. So I guess the Rebbe wanted us to read it and to think about it and to learn it. These letters were sent by the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe 10 years after the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were married. The Rebbe and Rebbetzin were married in Kislev of Tafresh Peites. That is December of 1928. So here are letters from December of 1938, or from Kislev of Tafresh Sadik Tes. It happens to be that these are from the last few letters the Rebbe ever received from his father. And that's because Pesach time, a little before Pesach, that's when the KGB came, arrested the Rebbe's father, and from then there was no correspondence. So this is mamish 2 or 3 months before that. The Rebbe was marking his 10-year anniversary. So look at this letter that the Rebbe published. Chav Beis Kislev, Tafresh Tzadik Tes. Chav Beis Kislev, that's the end of 1938. So the letter begins and says as follows. It says as follows. Kemaimer, as Chazal say, Banei, children, along with a few other things, b'mazala talyo milsa. This is a Gemara. The Gemara in Mayed Katan says that there are 3 things. Bane chaya amazoina. Here the Rebbe's father is only quoting Bani, children. Having children depends on mazel. Now you get into a whole discussion. What does mazel mean? I'm sure the Rebbe's father here meant whatever it means al pi Kabbalah, which doesn't need to concern us here now. The whole purpose of marriage is to be able to have children. Magam, especially acharei esher shanim, after 10 years. Then this the Rebbe is writing. The Rebbe's father is writing this to the Rebbe, at his 10-year anniversary. Then he goes on to say, V'atan lemisper yud shanim. Why is the din 10 years? Yesh loymar. So the Rebbe's father says 2 things. One thing is that misper eser is roimiz al shleimus. It indicates completion. Where do we see that? There's Asara Mamaris, Shebahen Nivro Ilam, the 10 utterances with which God created the world. And there's Yud Dibros, the Asara, the 10 Commandments. Then there's the Yud Hilulim, which the Gemara says is significant, the last kapitel Tilim, kapitel Kofnun. If you take away the first pasuk and the last pasuk, and you count how many halalukas there are in that chapter, it equals 10. The Gemara says that's significant. And why do you have all these areas of 10? Is because of the 10 spheres. The 10 spheres, a big concept in Kabbalah, of the Eibusher created within himself 10 spheres through which he created the world. And so that's one reason why the number is 10 years. 10 is an important number in Yiddishkeit, an important number in Torah, an important number in Kabbalah. But then the Rebbe's father went on to say a second reason why the din is 10 years. There's another reason. You can have, theoretically, 12 pregnancies in a 10-year span. And he brings a source in from Rashi in the Gemara, where Rashi does the math and explains that that's what it needs to be. Why is that important? For a Kabbalistic reason. Because he says, you have Yud Beis Hiburim, Yud Beis Partzufim. I'm not going to try to sit here and explain what exactly this means. The bottom line is, the Rebbe's father was explaining that there is something cosmically significant, Kabbalistically significant, something to do with the Partzufim and Olam HaAtzilos, with that you need to have 12, and somehow it takes 10 years to get that type of thing, and that's the Kabbalistic reason for the 12. The bottom line is, you see that the Rebbe's father was writing to the Rebbe about the 10-year marking, noting this din and explaining this din to the Rebbe at this time. Then, in a follow-up letter, that was Chof Beis Kislev. In a follow-up letter from Yud Tes Teves, that same year, Tov Reis Sadik Tes, the Rebbe's father writes to him as follows: Hincha Kosev, you write, she'eschalta la'aniach tefillin de shimusha rabba, that you started putting on the shimusha rabba tefillin. We know there's different ways of ordering the parshas in tefillin, and there's the Rashi version, there's the Rabbeinu Tam version, there's also the shimusha rabba. It seems that the Rebbe started putting on the shimusha rabba tefillin right around then at his 10-year anniversary. And he wrote to his father about it. So the Rebbe's father writes to him, okay, so you're putting on the tefillin shimusha rabba. He actually has a note of ambivalence where he writes, it's hard enough to keep our focus and to do Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam right. So, are we really taking on Shimusha Rabbah? But okay, we're taking on Shimusha Rabbah, he writes. And he writes, V'hei mechuvanim gam kein leneged hagimel dvarim of chaye, mizoini, and bani hatluyim b'mazala. The three types of tefillin correspond to the three things that require mazel: bani, chaye, and mizoini. And he says, ubani, children, is be'ikr shayachin l'tefillin de Shimusha Rabbah. So, chaye and mizoini is Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Bane, having children, that is connected to Shimusha Rabbah, which is corresponds to the level of Keser. That's where Bane comes from. And so therefore, what the Rebbe's father is saying, that putting on the third pier of Tefillin, putting on the Shimusha Rabbah of Tefillin, that is something that is necessary right now for you, because it's the type of bracha that you're looking for in your life. Again, it's like a very, very private thing. I was a little surprised. The Rebbe himself published this in Tov Shalom Beis, understanding that this is, I guess the Rebbe wanted that people should be aware of this and should learn this, which is what we just did. Okay, back to our question. What's our question? Our question is, how could it be that on the one hand you have a din, a very, very clear din, doesn't seem like there's any wiggle room, but then at the same time we see that in Ashkenaz and in Sfard, and it's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, but it goes back almost maybe 1,000 years it goes back, where this din is not being observed, at least sometimes not being observed, and definitely never being coerced by the Beis Din. How is this possible? So we're going to see 5 different approaches. 5 different approaches. Some of these are stronger, some of these are weaker. We'll call them the different heterim. The first heter and the second heter Aleph and heter Beis, was given by the Ra'avan himself. The Ra'avan was the source we saw before, writing in the early 1100s, saying, we don't deal with the asay of Pirya V'Rivya, we don't get involved. So if you look at the original quote, you'll see that he actually says the reason as well. What does he say? Normally the din is that a Beis Din has the coercive powers to force a divorce. However, V'hani Mili, when is that said? Be'eretz Yisrael. This only applies in Eretz Yisrael. We're very used to hearing, this din is only negay in Eretz Yisrael, especially if it comes to agriculture and things like that. We're very used to that. It's part of our Judaism. But we're very unused to hearing that type of thing for other areas of Yiddishkeit. Well, that's what Ra'avan, Rebbe Elazar Bar Nosson, does. He says, this whole din of the 10 years where the Beis Din is going to force is in Eretz Yisrael. Avo b'chutz la'aretz. No, if it's outside Eretz Yisrael, then the Beis Din isn't going to intervene. Why? What's my raya? Kivin the Amri, because we see by Avram, l'lamdecha she'ein yeshivas chutz la'aretz elo min aminim. We see that by Avram Avinu, the years that he didn't live in Eretz Yisrael didn't count, right? The clock only started to tick when they moved into Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, if you're not living in Eretz Yisrael, the clock never started ticking. So the average couple living in Worms or living in Mayence, in Germany in the 1100s, the clock never started ticking. So nirali de'en koifin, I don't think the court should force. Now he doesn't go to say nirali that it's lechatchila mutter. He doesn't say that the din is different and that the couple can happily stay together. He doesn't say that. But it's enough for him to say, if this is what the couple chooses, we're not going to intervene. We're not going to get involved. And he goes on to say, this is the reason why this is why courts don't get involved in enforcing this asay. And likewise the earlier generations didn't. Because we hold because the din only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Here it's a little stronger. It's not only that the court should enforce. Here it almost sounds like he's saying that the whole din doesn't apply if it's outside Eretz Yisrael. This is the first reason that he said something shocking, something very interesting. We'll see some people disagreed with this. You're going to tell me that what we opened up today's class with, a Tanu Rabbanan, a din, that is quoted in the Talmud Bavli, we're going to say, oh, by the way, this only applies in Eretz Yisrael, but this is what Rabbi Elazar ben Ramnasan said. But he wasn't done yet. He gave a second heter. V'oitanya, he quoted another Gemara. The Gemara says as follows. This is a Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Samach Hamud Beis. The Gemara says, Mishachara Beis HaMikdash, the moment the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, such a tragedy. Dinhu shaloi lisa isha v'shaloi lahalid banim. In Indian Garet, if you think about the nature and the enormity of this tragedy, we should have never married, we should have never had children. Sounds like we should bring Judaism to an end. Ella, so why don't we do this? Why didn't this become normative Judaism? You don't put a gzeira on the people that you know the people aren't going to keep. People are going to marry. People are going to have children. And so therefore, we couldn't make this enactment. But in Indian Garet, we should have made this enactment. Why is Rabbi Elazar ben Ramnasan bringing this? What he's trying to say is as follows. There's a havamina we shouldn't have been married, b'chla. There's a havamina, there's an ideal that we shouldn't have had children, b'chla. We weren't good enough to keep up with that value, so therefore we marry and we have children. Okay, so this couple that's married, they are living that ideal. They're living that ideal of, they're married, but okay, at least they're half of it, where they're not having children. This is the Gemara that he quotes, and this is his second heter to say, so at least, you know what, we're not going to get involved, and maybe even we're going to tell them that it's okay for them to stay together. Now what's really interesting, it sounds tenuous. It sounds really tenuous. All of the great Rabbanim in Ashkenaz supported this. What I mean by that is, this was quoted by Ravya, Rebbe Lezer ben Yoel Alevi, another one of the great Rishonim. This is quoted by the Or Zarua, Rabbi Yitzchak of Vienna. This was taught by Maram in Rottenburg. Some of the greatest names of the Rishonim in Ashkenaz, spanning full 200 years, the 1100s and the 1200s. Some of the greatest names of those 2 centuries, they quoted these 2 heterim from the Ravan, and they said, yeah, and we hold by it. We hold by it. It's when you come, at the same time this is happening, you have some big Rishonim in Svard who hear about this, namely the Ramban, and a little later the Rashba, and a little later the Ritva, both living in the 12 and the 1300s. They say, what? This is a crazy idea. And they're really, really against this idea. What's interesting is that the Rosh follows the Sephardi side. The Rosh was a student of the Maram at Rottenburg. He came from this long, rich tradition of Judaism in Ashkenaz. And then around sometime around the 1290s, he had to run away and he went to Spain. And he became the Gadol Adar in Spain. He's an interesting person because he lived in 2 worlds. He adopted the Sephardi approach that said, these heterim are terrible. Let's read what he said. This is the Russian Yevamis in Perek Vav, says as follows. V'loi mistabel klal. It makes no sense, lahoiris kain, to paskin based on this, sheyivatel adam mipirya v'rivya, that a person should not have children bisvara re'ua zu, with this very weak svara. Why? The chazina and ruba the inchi, we see most people, sheparim v'ravim b'chutzlart, you're able to have children outside Eretz Yisrael. With Avram Avinu, for whatever reason, there was a unique thing that he couldn't have children outside Eretz Yisrael. The bracha was only going to happen in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, for such a unique person, it makes sense to say that the clock will only start ticking when you get to Eretz Yisrael. But everybody else, we all live in Chutz La'aretz, we're all having children. So for 1 out of 1,000, who didn't have children, we're going to say it happened because he's living outside Eretz Yisrael. So much so, and we're going to say he doesn't have the chiyuv to have children. Problem number 1. Problem number 2. The gamkol elu amarayim de Bavli, de Bavel. Those amarayim in Bavel. The shakli v'taru b'haydino who got involved and discussed this din. Remember, first of all, there was the statement of the din itself. Then there was a discussion, does the Bezdin force, does the Bezdin not force? So you're going to say all the rabbis that got involved in that discussion, and there's a number of them, they were all talking about something that was not relevant to them. They were all talking about something. Kulan livnei Eretz Yisrael shakli v'tari. They were only discussing this as a matter relevant for Eretz Yisrael v'loy lahem, and not for them. This is what the Rosh says. He refuses to accept this. What about the second heter? The second heter quoted a Gemara. Really, we shouldn't be getting married. Really, we shouldn't be having children. So this couple is living that type of ideal. Well, the Gra, writing, much later, obviously in the 1700s, pointed out that if you just learn Tosis, you'll realize how that's not a heter whatsoever. Why is that? Because Tosfos and Baba Basra, on that Gemara that said, really, we shouldn't have gotten married, the Gemara asks, Tosfos asks, the Gemara says, Dinu shenigzar al atzmeinu shaloi liisa nasim, nashim, really, we shouldn't have got married. Frek Tosfos, Tema, haksi pruruvu, what's going on over here? You're supposed to have pruruvu. How could you say that in Inigah we shouldn't get married and have children? And for Tosfos, V'shema al oisan shekvar kemu pira v'rivya kamar. This Gemara, this statement, maybe what this is someone who already did the mitzvah. So maybe what the Gemara means is that after a person does the mitzvah pruruvu and was married and set up a family, then maybe you should say, you know what, why should I continue being married? That's the way Tosfos is explaining it. The bottom line is, Tosfos does not allow that Gemara to mean we're not having children. Tosfos does not allow that Gemara to mean we're not doing the mitzvah pruruvu. And if so, the heter, where you say, oh, at least they're living that ideal. Well, there is no such ideal because Tosfos rejected that as an ideal and refused to allow that Gemara to be taken literally. So therefore, in summary, what do we have right now? We have a heter that wasn't forced, that was thought of for at least 2 centuries in Ashkenaz. It was accepted there and it was ratified there until the Rosh came along and said that no, we don't accept this heter anymore. We don't like this heter. But the reality is, if you want to know, is this a reason why couples remain together? Yes, this is a reason. Is this a reason why, in actual fact, but they didn't get involved? Absolutely, it is a reason. However, it had much more force back then, and as the generations moved along and other voices were heard, it lost a little bit of its power, which is why we need to explore some of the other heterim that were said in this area. The third heter is a very nice heter. It makes a lot of sense. However, it's very limited. This one comes from the Ritva. The Ritva says as follows. It says a very simple point. If a man knows for himself that he is the problem, we know when it comes to infertility, there's different causes. There's male factor infertility. There's female factor, right? So if it's male factor, what's it going to help that he's going to divorce her? He's going to divorce her, marry another woman. Later, he's not going to have children. So if it's male factor infertility, so he says that if the guy says that I know it's because of me, then we let them stay married. And we say we can what's his evidence? Today, you could have evidence because you could have a doctor test. Then he's not, the Ritva is not saying you went to a fertility specialist. He's saying the man just says on his own. We say something, if he says on his own, we're going to go with that. We could believe it and it makes sense. Fine. So that's a heter that makes a lot of sense, but it's limited to those cases where a man will honestly say that, by the way, I believe that infertility is for me. So it is a heter that makes sense. It's a way of understanding this issue, but only for a limited number of cases. This is the Ritva in Yevamos. There is another heter that became very relevant. And that has to do with the Takanas of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom in Germany, sometime in the early 1000s, we assume, he made a number of Takanas. One of the Takanas he made is that a man cannot marry a second wife. He banned polygamy. A second thing that he made is that you can't force a divorce. Min HaTorah, a man could force a divorce on his wife. Okay? This is the Min HaTorah. Rabbeinu Gershom came along and said, this is not a good idea. We don't want men forcing their wives to get divorced. Divorce has to be by consent. Consent of both parties. He has to agree and she has to agree. So you can't divorce without her consent. So now the question becomes as follows. You have a couple that's married for 10 years. Now the man is like, I have my mitzvah, pruruvu, so I need a divorce. What happens if the woman says, I don't want a divorce? Before Rabbeinu Gershom, there's no such thing. You don't want a divorce. I am divorcing you. I'm following the din. But once you have Rabbeinu Gershom said that you're not allowed to forcibly divorce a wife. What happens if she says, I'm not interested. I don't want a divorce. So now the question is, does this din that after 10 years you need to get divorced, does it mean even going against the din of Rabbeinu Gershom? So this is already discussed by the Rishonim. Look at the Mordechai in Yevamos, in number 18, where he says as follows. Umitakanas Rabbeinu Gershom ve'elach, from the times of Rabbeinu Gershom, Shetikein, who enacted Shaloi legaresh isha ba'al karcha, that you can't forcibly divorce a wife. Tzarichion, I'm not sure. Im yesh legaresh ba'al karcha be'esha eser shanim, in the case of a man who dwelt with his wife for 10 years, could he now forcibly divorce his wife? I don't know. He brings one source that says, yeah, but he himself is not sure. Maybe the answer is no. The truth is, what is the machlokes depend on? It's a very simple question. Rabbeinu Gershom said no polygamy. He said no forcing a divorce. Did he mean even in a case of a mitzvah? That's it. Did he mean even in a case? What if it's like there's a mitzvah to do pruruvu. Does Rabbeinu Gershom say, I don't care the mitzvah pruruvu. You're not divorcing a wife forcibly. I don't care pruruvu. You're not taking a second marriage. Well, so did he make his enactment stam, or did he make his enactment even to include cases where a person wants to pursue a mitzvah? This is a major debate. The Rishonim debated this question, and the Achronim debated this question. The bottom line is that it did get in the way of, and this did become an actual fact, it did become a reason and why this din wasn't performed and why the Batei Dinim didn't get involved. Why? Because exactly that. You had cases where the guy maybe was considering, maybe he has a mitzvah to do divorce, maybe he called his Rav. The woman put an end to it right away. She said, by the way, I'm not taking a divorce. I'm not interested in a divorce. Right there and then, I'm not interested in a divorce. And now you come to this major machlokes haposkim, if you could forcibly divorce or not, which is a headache and a half. That itself is a reason not to get involved. In fact, one of the achronim, the Me'il Tzedakah, his name was Reb Yoina Lansdorfer. His dates are 1678 to 1712. A very important posek. So he has a tshuva about this question. And he says, okay, so min adin, the right thing is to get divorced, he says. But then he says, Umata higiyanu, now we need to deal with the following question. Levare im rasha lekaifa, could he force her? In other words, im tikein Rabbeinu Gershom takanaisa b'makom mitzvah. The question is, did Rabbeinu Gershom make his takana even where there's a place, even when there's a mitzvah or not? Kimi hen desfiralu, some place can hold, afilu b'makom mitzvah niskamu gzeidoso. That even where there's a mitzvah, nonetheless, as much as you're trying to do pruruvu, you cannot forcibly divorce a wife. Some people hold the makom mitzvah lo tikein. No, that if it's to do the mitzvah of pruruvu, there is no takana. Okay, so it's a machlokes. In our countries, he says something interesting. He lived in Central Europe. He says, Shnei drachim elu, these two paths, meaning Lisa acheres aleh, marrying a second wife, or to forcibly divorce the first one, Shneim ke'echad, both of them, loy toivim be'enei umois. The Gentiles do not like it. It's against secular law. Asher anachnu darim b'neihem. We're living amongst them. V'yesh b'zech shashes, and there are problems. Al kain, therefore, lo shamanu sheyasa me'ela. We have not heard that this should happen. He's saying something very interesting. It's two things. Number one, it's the very fact that there's an internal Jewish dispute whether you can forcibly divorce a woman in this case. That's internally Jewish, an internal Jewish question. Secondly, he says, for us to even consider the forcibly divorcing, because Christians are against it, I guess it's not the way the Christian governments were running their societies at that time. So therefore, for Jews to start doing it would turn into a mess, would turn into Chil Hashem. It would jeopardize the stability of the Jewish community living amongst the nations. So therefore, it's not something that happens. And so therefore, the reality is that if the woman said, oh yeah, willing and able, if that's what the woman said, willing and able to do divorce, so then fine. But the reality is that in many cases, the woman said, I'm not interested. I'm very happy in this marriage. I don't have a chiyuv of pruruvu. I don't have that chiyuv. It's on the chiyuv on the man. I'm very happy. I'm staying. So therefore, because she said that, forcing a divorce is not really possible. So the end result would be, okay, so they ended up staying married. So this would be the fourth heter that would explain. The problem with this is it's not coming, it's the starting point of this heter is where basically someone, the woman, it would seem, is doing something that's a little wrong or a little not so ideal. She's basically saying, I'm not going to let my husband do the mitzvah of pruruvu, and then our hands are tied, and so this ends up being the reality. Which brings us to the final heter hey, which came much later in the discussion. This comes from the Maharzach. The Maharzach is Meshulam Zalman Kohen. His dates are 1739 to 1819. He was a Rav in Germany. He wrote Shalos HaTshuvos Maharzach. Sometimes it's called Shalos HaTshuvos of Big Day Kahuna. He is a very important Rav for this discussion. And the reason is, because as far as I can tell, he's the first one, as far as I was able to find. First one where a couple says, we want to do the right thing. No, we know there's no forcing. We know there's no coercion. We want to do the right thing. Tell us what to do. I believe he's the first one where you see an effort to try to say, you know something, you guys could stay together. You know something, you guys could stay together. He's going to come up with an argument, not only that the Bedzin's not going to get involved. His argument goes further. He's going to try to come up with a reason to say, you know what, you guys could stay together. How? So let's see what he has to say. First, let's look at the case, because it's an interesting case, the way he describes it. He says that it's echad shenasa isha. There's someone who got married. Visha ima yoisem esa shanim v'lo yolda. They were together for 10 years, they did not have children. Now he wants to know what to do. The man basically had an idea, although we discussed before that perhaps that it's very complicated to force a divorce. There is something else that could be done. I'll withhold living with her in a normal way. I'll withhold, I'll stop supporting her. Right? Theoretically, it's possible. I'll stop living together. So she'll want to get. So should I be doing that? Or maybe keep the status quo, remain married. This man said, it's very hard for him to get divorced. She's a great wife. In his life right now, he's able to continue learning Torah. So it's like a dream world that he has. He's not so healthy. Although he does business, and although he learns, he's weak. And he needs to take medicine. And she takes care of him. So, although there's no question that the court can't force a divorce, that's been established already for hundreds of years. Remember, Marzak is writing in the 1700s. He wants to know, he wants to know, do I have this obligation? Do I have does what God want from me to do everything possible to get a divorce? That's his question that he turns to his Rav to ask to get the answer. So what does he say? It's a whole arichis, but he says, come, now let's talk about our case. He says, L'shitas haravan. Remember the Ravan, the first heter we spoke about? Ein din zeh shel eser shanim b'chutz la'aretz klal. He says, l'chatchila, there's no problem. The whole thing only applies in Eretz Yisrael. In chutz la'aretz, it's not an issue. If we were living in Germany in the 1100s and the 1200s, we would have been able to rely on that heter alone. However, there's the Rush. And when we're living in the 1700s, the Rush is a very important voice. So it's not like we could ignore him. So Aval Bikain, Chazarti al kolat stadim. This is the uniqueness of this tshuva. Chazarti al kolat stadim. I tried to come up with any reason. That's what Chazarti al kolat stadim is. Shaloi lahafrid bein adveikim, not to separate between this loving couple. And even according to the Rosh, who rejected the whole distinction between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael, even he would be okay with it. What's his heter? His heter deals with, it's a Gemara, the Rishonim discusses it. I'll just show you how the Ramah discusses it in Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah discusses the following case in Shulchan Aruch. What happens if Sukkot comes? You don't have an esrik, you don't have a lulav, you don't have a sukkah. The only way for you to get these things, and not like your friend has it and so therefore you could borrow from him. No one in town has a lulav. The only way you could get a lulav and esrik is if you pay $10,000. Is there a chiyuv to pay $10,000 to get the esrik? On the one hand, you would say, well, if you don't, how are you going to do the mitzvah? Right? On the other hand, $10,000 is a lot of money. What if it's $20,000? What if it's $30,000? What if it's $100,000? Where do you draw the line? At what point do we say, hold on, this is too much. You don't have to pay this money for the mitzvah. Says the Rama, any other mitzvah that you're gonna lose the chance. You don't have to spend a ton of money on it. And he quotes the Gemara, although it's talking about tzedakah, you don't give away more than a fifth of your possessions. You don't give away to tzedakah. So therefore, similarly, when it comes to lulav, if you're not going to give away more than a fifth of your possessions to do this mitzvah, afilu mitzvah veris, even if it means I'm not going to be able to do the mitzvah of lulav this year, and maybe the same thing will happen next year. You're not going to be able to do it next year too. However, dafke mitzvah saseh, this is only when it comes to mitzvah saseh, lulav, sukkah, these types of things. Avoloi saseh. What if you have a yid shows up in a town, no kosher food available, no kosher food available. The only thing he can eat is treif. But if he pays thousands of dollars, he got kosher food. Does he have to spend that money? Yeah. Why? What's the difference? Because here it's not a mitzvah saseh. Here it's a loy saseh. And a loy saseh is treated different. A loy saseh, you're not allowed to say, I'm going to eat chazer to save money. No. You have to spend every last dollar. If it's a pikuach nefesh, fine. Pikuach nefesh is different. Then you could be over every loy saseh except for 3. But if it's not pikuach nefesh, then you need to spend all of your money. So So now, what's the point? The point is, Pru Revu is only what? It's an asay. It's not a lois asay. It's the first asay. It's a very important asay. But at the end of the day, it's only an asay. So therefore, says Reb Meshulam Zalman HaKoyen, he does it like this. He says like this. You're not going to have to pay a lot of money to do this mitzvah. Now, why would there be a lot of payment here? Because when there's a divorce in Jewish law, that means there's a payout for the ksuba. Now, the payout for the ksuba itself is a complicated subject. How much money does it actually translate? It actually fluctuates based on the price of silver. And there's different shittas. Some shittas today would say it's, a few $1,000s. Some shittas would say that it's more, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000. All it depends, different cheshbonos on how you weigh the silver and how you figure these things out. So it's complicated. But what the point is, what he says is, he assumes that it's a higher price. He assumes the higher number for what the ksuba is. So in other words, for you to do the mitzvah of pruruvu, which means divorcing woman A in order to marry woman B, you're going to have to shell out a lot of money. That's a lot of money. That's going to end up being more than a chaimish, more than a fifth of the money that you own right now. More than a fifth of the money that you own right now. You don't have the chiyuv to do it. And so therefore, he says, this should be treated like a esrog, like a lulav, like any other mitzvah haseh. And so therefore, there is no chiyuv to shell out that type of cash. That is his heter that he tells this man why it's okay for him to stay with her. Okay? It's a very, very interesting argument. Some would say maybe there's a difference. Lulav, you don't do it this year, maybe you do it next year. Pruruvu, if you don't do it, then you don't do it, right? Your whole life it's not happening. Fine, doesn't matter. Reb Meshulam Zalman HaKohen was very comfortable with this argument, and he said therefore, although we end up having a din, the din in the Talmud says you have to divorce her. The din in the Talmud says not only you have to divorce, and you have to obviously pay out the ksuba. And what is he saying? What he's saying is, one second, that means you have to pay too much money for a mitzvah saseh. There's a heter, you don't have to go ahead and you don't have to do it. Fine. Now, what if, let me say this differently. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was a posek of the previous generation. And he tapped into the same resource, the same ramah, the same question of how much money that you need to spend. And he dealt with a very similar case, but in a different way. His cheshbon basically went like this. Forget the ksuba. Put the ksuba aside. If Torah tells you you don't have to spend a certain dollar amount, if Torah tells you you don't have to spend a certain dollar amount to do the mitzvah, what if I came to this couple and I said, how much money would you be willing to pay to stay together? Would you be willing to pay $100,000 to stay together? If the couple's answer is, yeah, absolutely, we would pay that money to stay together, then by definition, you telling them to separate is a bigger ask than this huge chunk of money. So Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, although he didn't quote Reb Meshulam Zalman HaKohen, he went direct to the Ramah, and what he said is, forget the ksuba. He was dealing there with a case of a couple who they have a genetic disorder, and the children that are going to be born are going to have this genetic disorder, which causes them so much pain and anxiety today. So he says that the avoiding that pain and that anxiety, trying to avoid that pain and anxiety today is if it's okay to avoid spending a big chunk of money, how much more so it's okay to avoid that type of pain. And so therefore he was matir for them to go on birth control. And he says, and you don't have to go through a divorce. He says, you don't have to go through a divorce because that pain is a bigger price than what is necessary to pay for a mitzvah saseh. This actually is very interesting because I think this is probably intuitively why, at least for the last few hundred years, why couples, many couples, some probably did separate, but why many couples didn't separate. And you're talking about people who are Yerei Shamayim, who want to follow what halacha is. We're not talking about people who are trying to skirt the law. I think intuitively it was more along these lines of what Rav Shlomo Zalman was saying. The idea being that as much as there's a mitzvah, every mitzvah has a limit to how much you need to spend, and this is just asking way too much. Now, we may say, but one second. The Mishnah and the Brisa did say that this is what you need to do. So here is a simple point that we discussed in a previous class that it's important to come back to here. And that is, what is marriage? Why do people get married? What are we looking for in a marriage? And the answer, as simple as it is actually complicated. In every generation, there's a different answer to that. I shouldn't say every generation, but very often throughout history, there's a different answer to that question. Sometimes in marriage, the primary thing that a society and a community is looking at is the creation of a family, continuity. Sometimes it's about the economics. It's about the stability, the dowry that's going to go from her to him, the connections that he's going to get through marrying into her family that's going to be able to get him to stand up on his feet. And there's a lot of evidence, and we spoke about this in other classes, that some of these other factors were primary in what drove a shidduch to happen and for the shidduch to continue to flourish and for the marriage to be executed. It's only when you're living in a generation where the relationship is front and center, which is where people have conversations about the shidduch needs to be compatibility and right emotional compatibility, right? Because the relationship becomes front and center. Dafka, when the relationship becomes front and center, is where you are in a society that Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach would tell you, by the way, now the ask is too much. Whereas in a society in where the relationship wasn't so much about that, perhaps the ask wasn't so much. And so therefore, this would be one way of thinking about the Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's heter. So in summary, let's just summarize the points that we saw. We saw the heter, only Eretz Yisrael. We saw the heter, really ideal is not to be married and have children. Okay. While it flourished in Ashkenaz for a while, the end of the day, and it had a lot of influence, at the end of the day, it became untenable to rely on that once the other voices were heard on the subject. We saw the heter of male factor infertility. Great. That's a very, very good heter, but it's only going to work for those limited cases. We saw the heter of can't forcibly divorce a wife. And she says no, end of story. Okay, there's truth to why this actually happened. This actually played a role in why the law wasn't observed. But at the end of the day, it relies on someone saying, I'm not going to allow the right thing to happen, which makes it a little bit of an odd thing. But at the end of the day, it had its impact on reality. And then we saw the final heter. The final heter was, you don't have to pay. That price tag is too big to pay. In its original iteration, by the Meshulam Zalman HaKohen, who, as I noted, he is the first one to say, by the way, I'm looking for a heter to say that lichatchila you could stay together. He's the first one on record that I saw say such a thing. He does it with the ksuba. The ksuba payout is too much that you need to pay for a mitzvah saseh. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach does the same thing, just forgets the ksuba, and just says, that price is too much to pay. If you don't have to pay a choimish for the mitzvah, you don't have to pay that anguish that you would go through for the divorce. And I explained, and I gave a rationale for why Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's point would be a point in the 20th century, and why it wouldn't have been a point 1800 years prior. Okay, we need to conclude with the following, because this is one of the most fascinating pieces in Jewish literature that is on this subject. It's a medrash rabbah. It's an unbelievable medrash. The medrash says as follows. This is in Shir HaShirim. The medrash says as follows. It first quotes the din. If you're married for 10 years, you can't withhold yourself any longer from doing the mitzvah of Pru Revu, and the person needs to figure out a way how to do the mitzvah. And then it says this story. There's a story of a woman in Tzidon. Tzidon today is in Lebanon. She was together with her husband for 10 years, did not have a child. They came to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So now we know when this happened. Happened sometime in the 3rd century. Happened sometime in the 2nd century. They wanted to separate one from the other. In other words, they came to him, give us a get. Amar Lahain, Reb Shimon said something very interesting to them. And this is where the story starts becoming bizarre. Chayechon, by your very lives. In other words, you got to do this. Keshem shenizdavaktem lazeh, zeh lazeh b'machol v'mishteh. Just like when you got married, you did the mitzvah of marriage, you made a feast. Kach einat misparshim ela metoich machol mishteh. So you don't separate without you. When you're separating, you need to make a feast as well. In other words, this is one of the earliest sources for a divorce party. And what's the logic? The logic was you're doing a mitzvah. Why are you separating? Because you're in a fight with each other? No. You're separating for the mitzvah peruvu. Why did you celebrate by the wedding? Because of the mitzvah peruvu. Why is this divorce happening? Because of the mitzvah peruvu. Make a party. Okay. They followed his advice. They made a big festival. A big meal. And he drank a lot. He became inebriated. Then he calmed down a little. Amarla. This is some point in the party. He says to her, Biti. This is a term of endearment in Tanakh. One could turn to his wife and say, my daughter. Any good object that I have in my home, take it. You're going back to your father's home. Anything that you like here, you can take. What did she do? After he fell asleep, she hinted to her slaves, her servants, male and female servants. So Amalehem said, Sa'uhu b'mita, pick up my husband, and take him, bring him to my father's house. Midnight comes, Ninar Mishnase, the man wakes up. Kivan the Pog Chamre, as his wine started departing from him. Amar la, he says, Biti, my daughter, my love. Heichan ani nasan, where am I? Amar le, b'veis Abba, you're in my father's house. Amar la, mali leveis avich. I love this line. Mali leveis avich. What connection do I have to your father, to your father's house? What connection do I have to my shver, my ex-shver? Amar le, so she said, didn't you tell me this in the evening? Any good object that I have at home, I can take and go to your father. I have no better object than you, and so therefore I took you. Come on, isn't this great? This doesn't get better than this. Okay, so now what happens? They go to Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Why did they go to Reb Shimon bar Yochai? They went to Reb Shimon bar Yochai because on the one hand we're supposed to be getting divorced. On the other hand, we made a deal. And the deal was, I could take anything, which means I took the husband. So are we allowed to be together or not allowed to be together? Okay, now the din is you're not allowed to be together, right? Well, look what happened. V'amad v'yispalel aleim. Reb Shimon bar Yochai davened for them, v'nifgedu, and they had children. Continues the Medrash and says, Lil Amedcha, which teaches you, Ma Kadosh Baruch Hu poiked akaris, just like God answers the cry of the barren woman and blesses her with children, as tzaddikim poiktem akaris. So the tzaddik could actually answer, obviously with Hashem's koyach, but the tzaddik has the ability to daven and to give this bracha that the barren woman should have children. Then the Medrash continues and says, and it goes on to say, if one human being looked at another human being in the eye and said, there's nothing better in my life than you, and what happened was they had a Yeshua. So Yidden, who are compared to Chassan and Kala, when we look God in the eye, and when we say, like she said to him, by the way, we have a lot of good stuff in life, but as much as all the good things we have in life, there's nothing that's as good as you. When we say that to the Eibishter, that's going to bring the Gula. Just like for her, it brought her Yeshua when she said it to him. So for us, it's going to bring the Gula. Alachas kama v'kama, that this is going to bring the Gula. What's this Medrash? What's this Medrash teaching us? On the very one level, let's start with the last line. That we should turn to God like the woman in the story and say, God, we have so much in life, but guess what? The most important thing is you. Okay, beautiful didactic message, wonderful. But that's not the only thing the Medrash is saying. What's another thing the Medrash is saying? Oh, the great power of the tzaddik, Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Clearly, the Medrash says, this teaches you that the Reb Shimon bar Yochai has the power to daven for a couple, that they should have children, and wow, so amazing. But that's not the only thing the Medrash is saying. If you look at the story itself, there does seem to be a voice, an echo in this story that says something's not right about the din. And I don't know how common this is in Midrashim to see, where you have a din. On the one hand, there's a din. It's a straight up din. It's a clear din. And we're not talking about coming hundreds of years later. This is a Medrash. This is an old story. The fact that it was recorded seems to be an echo of a voice of someone saying and feeling, but that din is not right. It's not okay. Now, it's not advocating a violation of the din. In a way it is, because what happened? The couple resumed living together. It's only weeks and months later that they had children. So after 10 years, they're living with each other. So there is a heter from a Rav here, where the Reb Shimon bar Yochai was allowing the couple to live together. But at the end of the day, the story went out of its way to say that they had a child. In other words, it's not like they're going to live forever without children. The story went, and the Bala, a story, was careful to write that they ended up having children. So, on the one hand, yes, there is the halacha, the pruruvu is important, the end result of children is important, but I didn't see Mefarshim addressing this, but it does seem that you have over here an echo of a shtickle protest that says, as much as this is the din, but come on, it's not really right. In an ideal world, this is not what's supposed to be happening. In a sense, what I said, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was saying that if it's so painful, then there is no chiyuv, and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach put that into Talmudic language and justified it. Well, really, you already see the beginnings of that in this Medrash, in where Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai allowed this couple to continue living together. Why? Because for her, being separated from this husband was considered unthinkable. Anyway, I'll just conclude and say there's a Chassidish story with the Tzemach Tzedek and Reb Hillel Paratcher that is very similar to this Medrash, same situation, where he basically, a couple after 10 years, and they made a psak din, let them have children. So instead of having them separate, it was a bracha that they should continue. So I guess that should be the main takeaway message, is that all those who are trying to have children, who want to do the mitzvah of Pru Revu, and they're facing difficulty, that the Eibusha should bench them the way Reb Shimon bar Yochai benched them, and they should find the happiness in building a family.